Ericka, it's been a true pleasure to be able to share places and spaces with you both during pandemic time and beyond there. And it's just a joy to have you here today. So thank you so much for making and creating time to share in this conversation. Welcome to the Future of the Present podcast.
Thank you very much, Aisha. I love the title, the theme.
Yeah.
The future of the present.
Yes.
Yes, it's beautiful. So thank you for inviting me and taking the time to do this. It's wonderful.
Oh my goodness, it's my pleasure and a joy. I kept feeling like we were on so many resonance points, and I kept seeing the circles of folks, friends, and all the things overlapping. And so, yeah, all that to say, I'm excited and very grateful. I wanted to open with a question by way of the late and great revolutionary American Grace Lee Boggs, who would often ask, "What time is it on the clock of the world?" What time is it on the clock of the world? Curious what's on your heart.
Well, it's a great question, and particularly in 2021. It's a great question in any year or any month or on any day. But right now, I feel as if we have a bit more time to get it right. What do they call it? The 11th hour
Mm-hmm.
of the world, the climate, the people, the animals, the water, the air, the oceans. Everything is waiting on us to get that we are not just individuals living our individual existence on the planet, that our lives are consequence to one another. All the beings' lives are of consequence to one another. And I can't speak for every continent in the world, but I can say that in the part of North America that we call the United States, which, by the way, has the name Turtle Island, that's its indigenous name translated, that we are moving fast to nowhere, generally, and that we don't take the time to settle in like we did before we began this interview, by breathing and being present in the present. And I learned to do this when I was incarcerated. I was always asking myself, what time is it? But not on the clock on some wall somewhere, but in my heart. And when I think of the babies at the borders of our United States, what time is it? Where are we? What are we doing? Who are we waiting for? So Grace Lee Boggs asks, in her inimitable way, a really beautiful question for all of us. And I'm sure she didn't ask it last month. She couldn't have. And there are those of us who think the world changed because of COVID-19. It did shift. Many changes occurred, but for hundreds of years, that question has been being asked here in the United States over and over again in many different languages. Before we go on, I want to acknowledge that I sit on the land of the Ohlone peoples, which has unceded territories in Oakland, San Francisco, areas of California. And as I was thinking about Grace's question, I thought, well, whose land are we on? And if we look around the world, we'll see that indigenous people of all kinds historically have, until in the instance of talking about the life of humanity, have until recently been taken care of by indigenous peoples. And in the United States, with all of the misunderstanding of immigrant peoples, they are the only non-immigrants for the United States. And we make them invisible, even in sometimes in circles of activism. We're not bringing them forward. So I wanted to acknowledge where I sit, where I work, where I live, where I love, where I've raised my children, where I take care of the people around me. I am on indigenous land.
Mm. Ooh.
And I think back to that question that Gracie Boggs asks, if we were thinking about all of the peoples of the world, we would not, the big we would not be in the unhealthy state we are in.
Mm. Ooh. Thank you. Um, Also, on that note, I just want to acknowledge and center and remember the future activism as well as the present. Um, Here, as I stream in from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on occupied Lenni Lenape land, also with roots in occupied Duwamish territory in the Seattle area and Japan, where we know there are indigenous folks and First Nations folks all around the world, whether we're talking about the Ainu or the Ryukyu people, in what many know now as Okinawa, just the expansiveness and the locality. Yes, yes, and I hear that point of sustainability, which kind of brings me into the next question, in that I'm thinking a lot during this time as we see kind of the headlines surface about anti-Asian racism, which we know has existed for a long time. And also in leading up to this conversation, we are writing a bit about how we could talk about Black and Asian solidarity and what does that look like. And so I'm kind of curious also with this note of sustainability that I'm already hearing emerge. What historical lessons do we need to draw on today in terms of Black and Asian solidarity? And how can we keep building on that momentum that already precedes this moment in time?
We can learn about history, for one thing. If we are too young to have experienced the internment camps for Japanese American people, I'm glad if there are people that are too young to have experienced that, or to have that passed on to them by their families. However, the history is there, and we should talk about it. We should know what it is, and we should talk about it. And I believe, because I was raised up in activism in the Black Panther Party, we formed coalitions with all of the organizations that were engaged in community. All of them. It didn't matter whether we absolutely loved their beliefs or did not. But the power of the people is expressed through coalition building and communication across any literally man-made racial, cultural, gender, language, and so on divides. They were literally created for the purpose of control. And in the Black Panther Party, that's a function of imperialism, by the way. But in the Black Panther Party, we just decided, well, when we say all power to the people, we mean literally that. All power to all the people. Indigenous, Asian American, Latinx, African American, and the whole African diaspora, which is ever closer in the last century or so. And that, so we worked with organizations that were pivotal in movements in the United States, like Iwar Kuren, the Yellow Peril, the American Indian movement, in Auckland, New Zealand, people created a chapter of the Black Panther Party by reading about it in a newspaper. And they're celebrating this week, Aisha. They're celebrating their 50th anniversary. And they've invited me and Emery Douglas to come and speak, as they say, from Oakland to Auckland. And so, do people know about Pacific Islanders other than that term? Do they know what that means? Do they know what Samoan, Tongan, Maori, and other peoples went through to live in parts of Europe, or in their own countries for that matter? And so I think studying history is very important. And I know that you and I, and many people listening to your podcast would agree that many of us come from indigenous lines. And that is beautiful. That's not something to be hidden, or in terms of hair, straightened, or in terms of eyes, lids surgically shifted, or in terms of noses or lips or bodies or skin color. All of these things are a function of the indoctrination received so many generations ago, that now, if we aren't careful, people can believe that is beauty. They can believe that speaking a certain way is intelligence. They can believe that generosity of spirit comes with making billions of dollars. And none of those things are really true. Look at the land. Look at the peoples on the land and the animals. You know, there was a very running, not a joke, but a theory that when we first began what was called sheltering in place, and humans had to be inside for a while, which, by the way, wasn't lockdown. I was incarcerated. That's lockdown. I just want to make that point. That is lockdown. And by the way, my heart goes out to all of the incarcerated adults and teenagers that are in the real lockdown, if they're still alive, during this time of the global pandemic, that part of the pandemic. But anyway, there was this theory that the birds were chirping more loudly after we were not out and about and creating our normal, which we thought was normal, day-to-day busyness. And the flowers were blooming more quickly. Seemed like you could see the sun more clearly. The animals were happier. The oceans were cleaner. The air was less polluted. I mean, really. And it would make me laugh because from my vantage here in Oakland, I could see it and feel it. No systems had changed. The systemic inequities were still there. But we had been forced to slow down, and thereby the things most important, like our lives, became primary, and therefore nature responded in kind. So there's so many things that we can do, and coalition building with nature. How about that? People got into their yards again and in the dirt and started planting things and started growing food. I don't know that we want to stop that. We want to stop the behavior that was harmful, and we want to bring forward with us all the things that we've learned in this last 15 months, particularly that there is a parallel pandemic. We know about COVID-19, but why is it that so many, particularly European American people, woke up during this time? And the marker tended to be George Floyd. And then for you and I, we would ask, well, why then? Why not before? It was right there. It's been right there. But it took the slowdown and the inability to get up from those 9 minutes or more and turn your head or make an excuse. That was a gigantic alarm bell. No, like one of those big Taoist gongs. You know what I mean? That just reverberate through your being. And one woman said to me on a Zoom, and I'll never forget her, it was so beautiful. And she didn't say it because she thought it was beautiful. She said it because it was true. She said, Ericka, I want to say something. I'm a white woman. And I said, yeah, okay. And I've been looking at the country I live in, and I wonder, where did I think I was living before George Floyd was killed? Before the COVID-19 virus? What world was I living in? What was I thinking? And now I know I've got to do something. I can't wait on others. And because of that one woman, the 100 people in that Zoom shifted into a deeper and more meaningful conversation about inequities, racial and other inequities. It was brave of her, and I told her so. And it was also kind. Do you know what I mean? To just share it out loud and not make excuses and not wait for a law or an ordinance or a bill to change our behaviors. So it reminded me, her conversation with me and everybody else on that particular Zoom focused on racial inequities, reminded me of the conversations we had so long ago, decades ago, during the time of coalition building. We built coalition with the Young Patriots. They were poor and white. They had the same conditions in the Appalachian Mountain area and in some of the major cities that Black people have. But they were taught, well, I might be poor, but I'm not a Black. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying Black and not saying the other word. But they got it, the Young Patriots. They were young, they were poor, and some of them were mid-aged. And they, because of Fred Hampton, who was killed at age 21 and never should have had to leave this planet, they took his lead. We should form coalition. We should not be averse to one another and bringing harm to one another. We've got people who are living in conditions of poverty have the same situations wherever they are, and it was real. It was real, and we educated one another. If I didn't know about the concentration camps of the Japanese, there was always someone who would sit and talk to me about her mother or her auntie or herself being born in one of the camps. And I wanted to share with you one of my dear friends. She's passed on now. Her name is Yuri Kochiyama. And she was a Sunday school teacher at the time that just before the camps opened. And her father was from Japan, and he had family still there who he was in communication with. But when the executive order came down to round up and intern Japanese American people because of the war, really because of paranoia and fear and loss of control, that her father, who had just been hospitalized, was taken from his bed in their house. She was on her way to teach Sunday school and taken to a camp, and he died there 2 weeks later because he was recovering from surgery. This made Yuri think about what she was doing. It brought to her an understanding that we can't sit by and settle for. And then later in her life, she reached out to Malcolm X. And she shared the letters that she wrote to him with me. Dear Mr. X, she wanted to know about the Association of African American Unity that existed in Harlem. And they became friends through these letters. As a matter of fact, he also shared with her his experience of going to Mecca, that transformative experience of the small understanding of the Muslim world had heightened, and he was able to see brothers and sisters from everywhere as part of his family. In their connection, she decided to move her entire family, her husband, her children, who were all named after activists, by the way, I believe. She decided to move them all to Harlem. And the most touching thing was this story that she told me. And when I moved to Harlem, this little Japanese family, friend of Malcolm X, I would open my house every Friday night and people would come from the community. All kinds of people would come and we would talk about our world and what we could do out of love to shift what has been happening. It didn't just all of a sudden show up, what had been happening. And she said often Malcolm would come and he would sit in the corner and listen and just smile. Isn't that incredible?
Yeah. Ooh.
On the day he was killed at the Audubon Ballroom, which is now the El Hajj Malik El Shabazz and Betty Shabazz Educational Center in Harlem, Yuri was there to hear Malcolm speak. And she saw a struggle, a very familiar to me struggle. In other words, something was being orchestrated in the front row to distract. And she intuitively sensed that something was really wrong and that something could happen to Malcolm. She said, Ericka, I'm tiny. You see how tiny I am? Once all of this was happening, people did get distracted and people started moving about. And I just skirted through all the people and I got to the stage. At the moment the shots entered Malcolm and he fell. And I cradled his head in my arms where he took his last breath. Asian American, African American solidarity. Does it look like words we say to one another? No. It looks like understanding. It looks like understanding fueled by a great love. I always wondered who she was. I didn't meet her until later in her life. But she always knew me, and we bumped into each other through the Black Panther Party. But I didn't meet her at the time she was on the front of, I think it was either Life magazine or Look magazine. And you see this young Asian woman with, at the time in the 50s and 60s, cat-eye glasses, cradling Malcolm's body. I always wanted to know her, and I got to know her, and I'm so grateful. She also shared with me the history of Asian American and African American people in the United States
Mhm.
when the act that created quotas for Asian American people was in place. It was Black legislators who happened to have figured their way into office that went to bat for Asian Americans. And now we have the horror of young Black people not understanding what happened and not understanding that people came here poor or they were brought here to do work, not as slaves, but just about in some instances. They don't know that history. So what they see is that because of skin color, I will have to say, that the nature of white supremacy is such that Asian American people can be equated with, quote, good minorities. Yuri never believed any of that crap. There are many people who do not, but I would love it if we had courses that taught Asian American and African American solidarity. Also, I want to say that one of the largest chapters of the Black Panther Party outside the United States was in India, the Dalit Panthers. Did you know about them? Yeah, they still exist. They're more like a political party now, but
Mm.
the Dalits are the awful nickname for the Dalits in the caste system was
Mm.
untouchables. And so the Dalits rose up to break through the caste system, which has to be one very, very difficult thing to do. But they established a large chapter of the Black Panther Party, quite like the Pacific Islander people in New Zealand. So there are all these instances of understanding that we're in the same boat. And literally, some of us came over on some similar boats.
Yeah.
And and I have friends who, when they were soldiers in Vietnam, wanted to go and work with the Viet Cong because why are we killing brown people once they got there and they could see it? Because who educates an 18-year-old before they leave the unit? What is the education we receive about racial formation anywhere in the world? You have to be a college student and literally seek it out. And now we have this, not just a threat, but a design to wipe out all of it. So I think in community, we could do a very good thing by bringing people together and talking about history. And you can't compare internment camps to American chattel slavery, but nobody's talking about comparison. Let's just acknowledge what happened. This is what happened.
Mm.
And then there's the Gadar Party. They were Sikhs. And they migrated to Canada. Then I'm making a real long story short. They migrated to Canada. Then Canada was too cold, so they ended up migrating to California. And many of them were, by the way, ship workers because they came over on ships, but they were poor, in financially poor. That word poor indicates poverty of spirit. And there's never, in poor people, there's never poverty of spirit, nor poverty of consciousness. It's just financial, it's economic inequity. So I didn't find out about them until, let's say, 2012. about the Gadar Party because I met a woman named Aisha Gill, whose family is descendant from them. And uh, a friend of mine, a professor at San Francisco State, Simi Makijani, brought together a huge group of young Asian American activists from the diaspora, not just Chinese or Korean or Indian, but any and everybody was invited into an intergenerational conversation with Aisha Gill and me. And I've never forgotten it because I was learning about the Gadar Party and Aisha was learning about the Black Panther Party, and there were so many similarities. So I'm so grateful that you were willing to talk about this. And I don't know why that we think talking about, in many cultures, including African American culture, we think that talking about history is shameful because somehow we're beyond it. But look at the world, we're not. We're not beyond it at all.
Whew, thank you so much. So many just powerful stories, and if you see me move to tears, it's
I would sit with Yuri and cry all the time. All the time. They had such a dear and close friendship. And who would know that if Yuri hadn't? She wrote a book called Passing It Forward. You can probably find it.
yes.
She also is in a documentary film with Angela Davis.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's a way to let your listeners know about that book and the name of the film, that would be great. And I think, I really do. I think that it's really very important to have this as a priority conversation everywhere we go, because there is, I mean, the uptick in Asian violent hate crimes against Asian American people are directly affecting us all. The community I live in Oakland, you know Oakland, so you know where Lake Merritt is. Lake Merritt is kind of central in the city of Oakland. And so I live east of Lake Merritt in a Southeast Asian and Black community. That's just the way it fell out. Nobody intended it. It's not an intentional community, but it feels that way because we have a Buddhist temple on each of the far corners of our neighborhood. Isn't that beautiful?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody touches it and nobody destroys anything. Nobody takes the oranges. Nobody dumps mattresses anymore in those areas. It's gorgeous. And then when someone passes, there are bells and gongs and flags and food and everything. And I remember one of the neighbors saying to me, "Are we too loud, Ericka?" Loud? No, you're wonderful. Keep doing it. I've never lived in a community like this, but it's not a fancy community. It's not where somebody, the people who say, "Is it a safe community?" Well, then they wouldn't want to live here because it's just folks. And I think about how important my neighborhood is to me, that I know all of the people and that we look out for one another. There's no sense that somebody is going to be harmful until it happens. And so there are young people of color who believe that Asian American people are wealthy. No, not like that. Any more so than African American people could be wealthy, right? So in my neighborhood, I've experienced that kind of thing with the elders. And it's just heartbreaking because they're like my grandmothers, except that I do not speak their languages, you know? So I don't want to be rude and just knock on the door and say, how can I help? But there are people who do,
Mm-hmm.
who have that resonance. So I'm saying all of these things because it's at the top of my heart today. It's always on my mind. How are we treating the peoples that we are around every day? Which ones do we decide are our people? This is my community. Yes, I am African American. Both my parents are African American. But is that where it stops? No, nor should it. And that was the basis of the Black Panther Party. Like I said, I was raised up in the Black Panther Party where all power to the people really meant what it says.
Mm.
So I share stories because I'm hoping that your listeners will have imaginative ideas of joining one another. By the way, there's one thing I didn't think of that I just want to mention, and then you can ask your whatever your next question is. And I forgot to mention the Third World Women's Alliance, and a lot of people don't have a clue that they existed. I'm serious. In that time, in the 60s and 70s, when feminism, most women of color had an allergic response to hearing that term feminism because it was so very white and middle class and exclusive, the concepts and the ideologies for the most part. This wasn't, in the beginning, this wasn't even a place where white LGBTQ women felt comfortable, much less people of color. And the Third World Women's Alliance arose. First, African American women were in the leading group, and then Asian American women, right? And so when I was the director of Oakland Community School, which was the flagship community survival program of the Black Panther Party, I got a press release that came from Allen Temple Baptist Church, which was the largest African American Baptist church and still is in Oakland. And the press release was about the tremendously high rates of infant mortality and maternal morbidity in East Oakland compared to rates in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And it broke my heart to read. I read it over and over again, and I go, wait. So what? Then I start thinking systems, and I started thinking, what's Highland Hospital, the county hospital, able to do in this regard? What can I do? What can Oakland Community School do? Are there women's organizations I can call upon? And I don't remember who told me, but I was told about the Third World Women's Alliance, and I called them. And we created the coalition to fight infant mortality. And it later changed its name to the Coalition Against Infant Mortality because we really weren't fighting anybody. And because of the work that we did together with the parents and pregnant moms and their babies and their children, these are moms from the community, and the members of the Third World Women's Alliance and me, we would go to the County Board of Supervisors and say, what is Highland Hospital going to do? Its OBGYN department is not fully serving the communities because it can't. There's more interest in its ER is phenomenal, right? But the OBGYN department, you might deliver your child sitting on the waiting room bench. Now, this was in the 70s. And as the result of visits to the County Board of Supervisors, the OBGYN department at Highland Hospital shifted. The County Board of Supervisors can make a difference. And we knew it. And so we went there and we gave testimony and listened to really racist and ridiculous things that some of the supervisors said, but the one Black supervisor, John George, what a guy. He listened and listened carefully, and also encouraged his colleagues who were spewing racist ideas about, it wouldn't be happening if we would change our diets, ridiculous things like that. Yeah, I know, it's ridiculous. He listened and he began changing things. But what if there'd been no Third World Women's Alliance? Because then reproductive rights at the level of I'm talking about like forced sterilization was not considered a feminist issue. And the rights of a pregnant woman, I know the rights of a pregnant woman were not considered in the same way because of the lens that people were viewing the world through. We all look at the world through our own lens. So I'm telling you all these stories because I don't believe that it's impossible to do it again. For us to coalesce, for us to build cross organizational or cross formation organizations. I don't think it's impossible because we're all human beings. We're all human beings. And so I just wanted to share that about the Third World Women's Alliance.
Ooh, there's so many powerful stories, and her stories, their stories, our stories.
And then I'm just one person, and I may have some of it all, crazy, but we begin somewhere, right? And then we get it right. And yeah, it's something that we can do in this time where we're feeling despairing, where one bill, one law after the other, one crazy conspiracy after the other, one moving backward idea, or worse, congressional or Senate. I don't think it's hard for me to call them what they are, what the things are. They're not. They don't make sense in terms of the world we live in. So I'm having trouble calling them something that makes sense. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there has to be something that we can do, and that's what the movements in the '60s were about. And I think it was people. Well, we weren't waiting for one particular party or the other to do it.